good to be here today. Interesting experience for me because I think the last time I was in a lecture theatre, I was actually on that side. So this is an interesting experience. Let's get the basic stuff out of the way, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the topic that I'm going to talk to you about. So LCH Clearnet, one would like to think is that as a platinum sponsor, requires no introduction. Largest clearinghouse in the world. Certainly, as far as swaps are concerned or interest rate derivatives are concerned, we are the largest in the world. About myself, I'm the CTO for Group Business Services. Covers a range of SINs, definitely on the technology side, covering collateral and liquidity management. You probably hear quite a lot about collateral these days, I would think. Risk, and all of our online services. My own background, just quickly. So I'm kind of a jack of many trades, actually. I started out life as a chemical engineer. I wanted to be an architect. I actually wanted to be a cartoonist at Disney, but there we are. Since then, I qualified as an accountant and then made my way into, where was it? CSFB, actually, 20 years ago. And that was the start of my career in technology and financial services. Hopefully, one of the things that you'll take away from my particular background is that I think nowadays, it doesn't necessarily follow that you need to specialize in any particular area to go in the direction that you want to go. Technical skills and things are always a good thing to have, but there are other routes into what you want to do. So what's today's topic about? I've got to be honest, when I was looking at some of the topics that were being spoken about today, I thought, I'm not going to say it's a little bit dry, but the thing is that you're going to hear about business knowledge, right? So I'm sure that in the course of the things that you've heard today, you will have heard about different aspects of the financial services industry, things which are topical in the industry. I'm sure there's quite a bit that you've heard about technology as well in financial services. So things like low latency, algorithmic trading, high frequency trading, so on and so forth. But you know there's a bridge between the two. There is a bridge between the two. You know, the business will come up with an idea. Let's take algo trading, for example. Algo trading, we think we're going to make a shed load of money. This is a great idea. Let's go and do that. And then they'll typically come to someone like me and say, right, this is a great idea. Let's go off and let's do this. But you know the process that we then go through between getting a good idea, deciding to do it, and then actually cutting the first line of code? There's a lot of considerations in between. So what I was thinking about today was actually, let me walk you through some of those considerations in the context of a project that I am doing. So this is going to be fun because actually what we're going to examine is some of the decisions that I've made. Now, I'm not saying I haven't been challenged on my decisions at LCH. I have. But if you want to challenge some of the decisions that I've made, please feel free to do so. So, a little bit of context about the project that I'm running at LCH at the moment. This is a multi-year program. We currently have collateral and liquidity management platforms across London, New York, and Paris. The idea is to rationalize all of those systems. There's 5 in total. You might ask yourself, why is there 5? That's because actually in one of our locations, the front office is entirely manual, or at least it was until May. You'll never see this again, by the way. When I went to one of our locations for the first time to see how they actually executed treasury deals, they actually have a book. They've got a red book with carbon copy paper in it. And every time a deal is done, you know a deal has been done because they have to stamp it with a machine. So I had to go and see that because you just don't see that in the industry anymore. Be that as it may, LCH has come a long way since then. So the project team is about 90 strong. I wanted to put that up there to give you some sort of idea around the size and scale of the program. We started in January last year. We went live in London, New York, and Paris for our liquidity management in May this year. We go live with collateral management in April next year for London, and then New York in May. So it's a very, very large program, and it's expensive. And I like spending lots of money. Decisions we're going to explore. Now, you know, this is kind of innocuous, really. Choice of SDLC. You really wouldn't think that this was really a big deal. For those of you who are from a computer science background and you look at you know, kind of project management methodologies or software development methodologies, you might think that that's a simple choice. It's not, and I'll show you why it isn't. We'll talk about build versus buy. That's an interesting point. So if you're from a computer science background, you might be of the opinion that largely we build software wherever we go. We don't. Sometimes we have to buy. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is the build versus buy question, how I dealt with that at LCH and what the eventual decision was. The last one is implementation strategy. Now, you know, when I was a developer, I always thought implementation strategy was fairly straightforward. I wrote the software, compiled the binary, send it out, and off you go. Yeah, the real world is nothing like that. Nothing like that at all. Implementation strategy is actually very, very important. It's actually all about adoption and how you roll out brand new systems in the context of your project and your organization. So that's what today's topic is going to be about. I think there's one footnote I would add, especially if you're in you know, a technical discipline, and that is that, look, you know, my slides, I look at my kind of logo down here, and it's a little bit boring, and Google and Yahoo are just so exciting. But you know, in the real world out there, if you're a computer or a software professional, the vast majority of software professionals actually don't work for Google and Yahoo. They actually work in the corporate technology environment. That means going to work for a business whose business may be something completely different. In the case of LCH, the business is clearing, but you work in the technology department there. And the vast majority of software professionals actually work in those environments. And it is very different to working for a software company. And hopefully some of the things that we'll talk about today will show you how those things can be different. I would love to have had a career in t-shirts and sandals and pizza, but unfortunately not. I certainly got the pizza anyway. So, essentially, I'm going to take my jacket off now, and no more. Working in a corporate technology environment is all actually about solving business problems. Now, you might have heard this before. It is about solving business problems. And when you come to solving business problems, there are any number of considerations that you have to go through before you might settle on a technology solution of some sort. So I'm hoping that some of you will have seen this piece anyway, people, process, and technology. But the other two are actually quite important as well, culture and environment. Why is culture and environment so important? And it's a little bit of a soft topic to some extent. And you might be asking yourself, well, if you're the CTO and you're a technology guy, why do you care? You do care. You do care a hell of a lot. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick assessment, which is up on the board, around my assessment of the environment in which I found myself in January. So let's talk about culture. So I'll tell you a little bit about LCH. So one of the systems that I'm taking out is a VAX VMS system. It's called banking. I mean, it's just the most unsexiest name ever. It just doesn't look good on my CV at all. But it's called banking because it was actually originally a retail banking system. It's 22 years old. It's VAX VMS. It's like Cuprinol. It does exactly what it says on the tin. And nobody knows how the hell it works. It's just this amazing black box that seems to work every single day. Now, if you ask yourself the question, right, if you look at the pace of change in technology and just look at the kind of choices and changes that you've made to the technology that you use over time, what does that tell you about LCH? 22 years on the same system. They're resistant to change. This is a real big deal. Being resistant to change. Over 22 years, one of the things that you'll find with systems that have been in for a long period of time is that after a while, people start constructing processes actually around the system to get around its constraints. And of course, the challenge in technology is that, guess what? That stuff is never documented. So it's like as I keep telling my team, we're on a voyage of, archaeology. It really is. But it's an important point in the culture. Our culture was one very much of being focused on operational processes, resistance to change. We have a lot of lifers, actually, at LCH. I'm not saying that LCH is a prison, but it tells you something about the organization. Nowadays, if you go to firms, it's unusual to find people who have been there for more than 3 to 5 years. Environment. Well, if you've had lectures on Emir, Dodd-Frank, you know that the world in financial services, particularly for clearinghouses, is changing rapidly. Got Emir, Dodd-Frank, Basel III is coming along, mandated clearing, more products, more asset classes. So the environment is one of rapid and evolving change. People, it kind of goes back to the point I was making to you, is that people are very, very experienced in the current processes. But if you imagine that you've been dealing with the same process for 22 years, you're very, very competent at the processes that you operate. But what you may lack, for example, is thought leadership, a sense of innovation, or even the knowledge of how things are done elsewhere. The technology, as I said, it's a 22-year-old VAX VMS system. Now, as we go through the slides, I've added these kind of ask yourself questions. It's not really meant to be cheesy. It seems a little bit cheesy, but honestly, I would ask yourself those questions. You know, given the context that I'm giving you, ask yourself those questions. What's UCL like? How does UCL stack up in these dimensions? And then, of course, challenge my decisions as we go through. The psychological factor is the biggest one. You could argue that the psychological factor should mean that I should never have taken the job. This project has actually been tried and failed twice before. But it's just my nature, you know, I kind of had three options. I can do that one, I can do that one. This one apparently is impossible. Sod it, we'll have a go at that. That's what I did. But this project has failed twice before, at large expense. If you think about yourself and you're in a commercial organization, whether you're the CEO or the chairman or otherwise, you know, how big of a factor is that in the decisions that you have to make in the business and in technology? It is I put that in bold because that's been one of the biggest challenges for us, actually. You know, if you've been involved with any of the two previous failures, would you want to participate in the third? That's a problem. These are the types of considerations that we have to get involved with. So, let's talk about the first decision. So hopefully, all I've tried to do here, by the way, is to give you a scene setting. I've given you the context of the project. I've given you a quick assessment across some of these dimensions. And hopefully now we'll just get into it around some of the decisions. So choice of SDLC. You know, for those of you in computer science, you guys should be used to all of this stuff. There's just so many different ways of doing things, right? There are a lot of different ways of running projects, delivering projects, writing software. All of that entails, you know, how do you interact with your users? How do you collect your requirements? How do you know that what you've built is the right thing? And there are a lot of different methodologies for how you do that. I mean, some of these I'm sure you're aware of: test-driven development, Six Sigma, extreme programming, DMake, the one that I hate the most, and Six Sigma. Any black belts in the room? Any Six Sigma black belts? No? Good. In which case I can reveal I hate Six Sigma as well. Spiral, RAD. RAD I think is an interesting one. You know, when I got into the industry 20 years ago, people always used to tell me that they were doing RAD. So RAD, the definition of RAD, in my experience, is the absence of process, right? What are you doing? I'm doing RAD. Really? Okay, RAD. So I actually chose an agile method. Now, here's the thing about agile methods. Agile methods are traditionally, they're traditionally kind of associated with incremental delivery on small chunks of functionality over a protracted period of time. It is very rare that they are associated with what is essentially a long-running project. Typically with where you'll see agile in financial services, for example, is once the initial system has gone in, the actual delivery of change after that tends to be agile. Why do we use iterative methods? It's very quick and easy to actually capture, you know, kind of small logical units of functionality, build that very quickly and get something out very quickly. So anybody in financial services will always tell you that it's all about change and rapid change, rapid change. So agile methods are actually very, very good for that. So I guess the question is that why did I choose an agile method for what is essentially a long-running project? It's very unusual. And yes, I have been challenged on this choice. Well, I did it for a couple of reasons, and some of which is explained up there. But essentially the rationale is to do with the assessment that I made. If processes have been around for 22 years and people are well versed in those processes, the notion that I could actually give them the entire business problem to actually solve and produce requirements, that's just like a recipe for disaster. In that environment, people have got to look at things in small bite-sized chunks. So it's a bit like, me going to Treasury Operations and saying that, you know what, we're going to have a third go at this, right? Tell me what you want in operations. It's not going to work. The other thing is that you've got a situation of evolving change. When I started this project, in fact, let me give you this as a context. Between January and November, so January last year and November this year, what change have I seen? When I started, we didn't have a CCP in New York. We didn't even have a CCP in New York. We started building that out, I think, round about the summer last year, and finally went live in January, February this year. We didn't have a CCP in New York. We had no idea what Dodd-Frank was going to bring. We had no idea what EMIR was going to look like. In fact, you could argue that actually we still don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know if you guys ever get the regulators to come in and talk to you. Please do, and when you do, let me know, because I have a lot of questions I want to ask them. We didn't know what those regulations were going to look like, and actually in collateral management, the regulations are key. The regulations are key because they define our account structures, how we're going to hold collateral, how we're going to deal with risk exposures. It's fundamental, it's core to what we're actually trying to deliver. I had no idea what that was going to look like. I've had 3 heads of operations in the time that I've been at LCH. So we're going through a lot of internal change as a result of changes in senior management. I'm on my 3rd head of operations. On the risk side, actually the entire risk team that I was dealing with when I arrived in January has just turned over in its entirety. It's a lot of change. And ask yourself this question: if you'd followed a traditional method and actually wanted to have done all of your analysis and defined all of your requirements up front, you know what I'd be doing now? I'd just be forever dealing with change requests. So that's why I chose an agile method. The whole point about an agile method is that you can get people to come in and define their requirements just in time. At the last possible moment when you have the most information available, plus they get to look at a bite-sized piece of functionality rather than trying to swallow the whole problem in one go. So that's why I chose Agile. In fact, I chose Scrum. I've put a couple of references on here. The second one is the one I want you to go and take a look at. Now, I'll tell you a little story. So I was at an IT Directors Forum about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And I came across a guy who works for a company who does large public sector contracts. Now, when I look at large public sector contracts, particularly in IT, you can imagine that all I think is 300 million, 400 million, just how much of that can I get? But there's an interesting thing about public sector IT contracts. They seem to have I wouldn't say not necessarily a high failure rate, but what they do have is cost overruns, late deliveries. In fact, the best example at the moment actually is Obamacare, right? I don't know if you guys are following that. And that's a website that went terribly wrong. Particularly disturbing for people like me who are in online services. But the reason why I want you to go and take a look at that reference is because the government, the UK government, is taking a look at its project management methodology. How does it go about delivering these projects? When I asked this guy who's actually done work in the NHS, he's done work in HMRC, Department of Education and Skills, the question I asked him, and I've got to be honest, I put my hat on as a taxpayer, why do they go wrong? You know what he told me? It's really interesting. What he said to me was that the government operates on this principle, and the principle is that if I outsource a piece of work, I can offload all of my delivery risk. Just stop and think about that for a second. What that means is that I'm responsible for delivering a system. I work for the government. And then what I do is I go and get a contractor, a Siemens or an EDS or somebody like that, and I say, you know what, you guys deliver that. And the working assumption is that if that goes wrong, I can just point to the contractor. Well, guess what? You can't. You know why? We people in the private sector are rather smart about this kind of stuff. We know how to manage risk. And what actually ends up happening is that these contracts, they tend to be commercially very, very favorable to the government when they're first written. But the changes are penal. So if you change your mind about a requirement, or you get to, kind of 6 months in the project and you say, well, I didn't want that screen like that and I wanted it a bit like that, the cost of change is penal in those contracts. So what inevitably ends up is you end up in a situation of litigation. That's actually where you end up. Now, the reason why I think that example is very interesting is because culturally, actually LCH was in a very similar space. When I came, we had the notion that actually getting in a supplier means that we can outsource the risk. I'm telling you this, you can never outsource your risk. You just can't do it. If you're on the hook for delivery, you're on the hook for delivery, right? So if you've done any kind of management theory about the difference between, kind of ownership and responsibility and how you can delegate authority, you've got to have skin in the game. That's how stuff gets done. That's how delivery happens. So, on the choice of SDLC, I chose Agile. I went with Scrum, which is this reference here. Please go and take a look at that second reference. I think it's really interesting because they have a new CIO in the Cabinet Office who's put a lot of thought into the issues around project delivery in the UK government as far as IT is concerned. And actually, and I feel good about this, of course, he's chosen an Agile way of doing things. So on the big, 300 million, 350 million sterling projects, he's actually going to go Agile. And to all my detractors, that's what I keep telling them. Look, the government's doing it, isn't that okay? The last one, this reference here, go and have a read of that one. And that's quite an interesting one as well. It's all about the trials and tribulations of running long-running, extended duration projects. It's actually quite an interesting article. And much of it deals with some of the other things that I've talked to you about, which are kind of, almost if you like, the abstract or soft bits that you have to deal with before you even get to the point of cutting code. So anybody want to challenge me on the choice of SDLC? I feel good. I feel good. Okay. Build versus buy. So another piece of history. So I became a permanent employee for the first time in financial services 7 years ago. Up to that point, I'd spent 15 to 17 years almost, I think, if I get the math right, as a consultant. And as a consultant, actually writing software. I've got to tell you something, I run a big project, it's 90 people, blah, 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 I'm a CTO, but I love writing code. In fact, I still write code at home. I love writing software. But when I came to LCH, I actually chose to buy and not to build. That's a big cultural change for me. Why did I choose to buy and not to build? And the reason is for some of these factors over here on the left-hand side. If you're a commercial company, there's this thing about core competencies, intellectual property, what differentiates you from your competitors. Those are the things that you need to invest in. Over the financial crisis, you will have seen very large companies starting to unwind what they call non-core businesses. And it's a similar sort of principle. What are you actually good at? What's your core competency? What are the things that you invest in that actually make you different from your competitors and result in a good earnings before interest and tax? Well, actually, in clearing, our intellectual property is actually risk management, right? So in terms of, managing the credit risk on interest rate derivatives, on settling and clearing listed derivatives or exchange-traded products, that's actually our intellectual property. That's the IP. That's what differentiates us. The rest of what we actually do, so for example, in the context of this project, which is collateral and liquidity management, this is just dime a dozen stuff. It's run-of-the-mill stuff. We accept collateral, we send messages to the custodian, we reflect it in the customer's account. Guess what? The guy next door is from Morgan Stanley. They do the same thing, right? They do exactly the same thing. So why would you build it? It doesn't actually make sense to build it. For a lot of stuff out there, there are good solutions, industry standard solutions which are out there, and for that stuff, it kind of makes more sense to buy that in instead of having to make all of the investment yourself to build that. If you imagine there's a pyramid, in the scope of the project that I'm doing, it's only the tip where we actually differentiate or have intellectual property. The rest of it, settling trades, settling custody transactions, this is run-of-the-mill stuff. This is operations. This is processing. It just has to be efficient. And there are plenty of products out in the marketplace which will actually do that for you. Another important reason why I chose Build, and this is an interesting one, is actually to do with scale. And let me tell you about scale. So LCH Clearnet as a company, even across London, New York, and Paris, we're a perfume company, we are 1,000 employees. That's it, 1,000 employees. I actually came to LCH Clearnet from Bank of America, right? And prior to that, I was working for Merrill, and we got bought out by Bank of America. The rest is history. But combined, when we were Merrill Lynch, we were 65,000 employees globally. After we combined with Bank of America, we were something like 160,000 employees globally. No, I wish it was only 160,000 technologists. We could have built so much stuff, but it wasn't. There are lots of other people in there. Sorry, how many Anne across?
100,000 in 2010. I think by 2013 it had gone to 280,000 globally.
Yeah, 280,000. I remember that number now. So you know what? Why is scale important? So I was a director in fixed income, currencies, and commodities technology at Bank of America. Globally, we're 1,000 people. But just in that technology group. You know, when you write software in a corporate environment, one of the things actually that is very often forgotten is that one of my responsibilities is actually, it's not just the delivery of software, it's the management of technology risk. Technology is great to use, but it also poses risk to businesses. How do you support it? How do you maintain it? The raison d'etre for this project is actually that Vax VMS, 22 years old, Cuprinol, does what it says on the tin, but you actually can't buy the skill set anymore. So part of what we have to do in technology is manage that risk. And why that relates to the issue of scale is that the moment you decide that you're going to build software, you are talking about some sort of large-scale organization. You are talking about taking on some substantive risk. You know, if you typically, if you've done software projects or written any kind of software, typically, you know, in a team of about 10 or 12 people writing a piece of software, there's really only 2 or 3 key guys, what we call key man risk. The moment you decide to build some software, that's what you're doing. You're betting the firm's future on 3 guys. I could tell you a very sordid tale about some people who made a lot of money doing that at CS First Boston, actually, many, many years ago. Look it up, NTPA. It was actually highlighted in the Investors Chronicle as one of 10 of the largest white elephant IT projects in financial services. One of the downsides of financial services, by the way, is that people have a lot of money. So they tend to go off on these flights of fancy. NTPA, I think we spent a yard. We spent about $1 billion on it. And in the end, it only replaced 2 systems. But it looked good on the screen, can I tell you? So, build versus buy. Scale, with 1,000 employees, the notion that I was ever going to scale, right, to even 20, 30, 40 people looking after a piece of intellectual property that we were building in-house, it's just impractical. The cost of the business, the risks that we would run, we just don't have that scale. So whereas up to this point in my career, I've always been building software because I've been working for tier 1 banks, the size and scale of LCH Clearnet means that that just really wasn't an option. So in this case, I chose to buy. I did do some build, but I built only where there was intellectual property. So like I said to you, risk. One of our core risk algorithms, actually we did build that. That kind of makes sense. That's our intellectual property. That's our differentiator. That's worth us spending and investing money in. But the rest of it, I bought. Couple of more references there for you to go and take a look. Implementation strategy was really about, you know, how we're going to go live. you know, you write a piece of software, it's all very exciting, or you bought a piece of software, you want to put it live, how on earth do you do it? Well, there's a range of different ways of doing it. Some of them are up there using parallel. So parallel, typically when you have two systems, the old system and the new system running in parallel, you decide the point at which you want to cut over, and then we do what's called a personality swap. You could do a big bang, which is exactly what it says on the tin, which is my preferred option. Then I like risk, which is you just say, today we're going to cut over and that's it. So in actual fact, I chose a combination of the both, actually. I chose a parallel run. I chose a parallel run and a phased rollout. Now, I'll just explain this very quickly why I chose this. Why did I choose a phased rollout? And what I mean by a phased rollout is that I actually went live in May with liquidity management. My rationale was very, very simple. Project has failed twice before. People are scared. They don't have confidence. So what's one of the things that you can do to build confidence in the organization is get them an early win. So although it cost us a little bit more, and it was quite traumatic for the project team to get an interim milestone in, actually what it did was actually build confidence in the organization that this project was actually going to work. So actually the behavior of my stakeholders over the course of the project has actually changed. Whereas when I started, they would go running away from me when I was in the corridor, because they didn't want anything to do with the project. After we went live with phase one, it started to become, well, actually I think this is going to work. And most recently it's become, oh my God, it's going to succeed, we all need a slice of the pie. Right? But that's a journey that stakeholders had to go on. The other reason for doing a parallel, I'm not a big fan of parallel runs. I mean, I would actually have a think about that. You know, there are a lot of challenges in doing parallel runs. But I had to do a parallel run actually because we're systemic in nature. You know, whereas in an investment bank, if I knocked out the risk for the FX options desk for 4 hours, it really didn't matter so much. They'll tell you different, but it really didn't matter so much. But actually at LCH, because we're a clearinghouse, if I can't actually accept or register trades, that causes a big problem in the financial system. So, few questions there for you. Last one. Really the point of this, software engineering and software delivery are not the same thing. I'm not saying that's the summation of my career. I'm hoping some of you have seen this before, but this is the thing you absolutely want to avoid. And if you want to avoid it, you need to take into account other factors that impact the technology choices and the design that you do before you even get there. People, process, technology, culture, environment, color of your shoes, age of your stakeholder. There's like a whole range of stuff that you should take into account. It's not enough, I'm telling you guys here and now, it is not enough to be technically proficient. You need to be commercially savvy, which is why these conferences are great, because you're getting business knowledge. But you also need to be, you know, kind of, as far as your interpersonal skills are concerned and your kind of emotional intelligence, you need an element of that as well. Times have changed.